There's been a lot of media coverage to the fact it's 20 years since the MG Rover factory closed down in Birmingham back in 2005. But what hasn't been touched on is how this could have been such a different story. I think this was a bit of a sliding doors moment, because back in 2000, the Phoenix 4, led by John Towers, were hailed as heroes for saving car production at the Longbridge factory. But theirs wasn't the first offer to take over MG Rover. And I think, had this other deal gone through, it could have had a very different ending. Let me explain. To do this story justice, I think I need to give you some background of where Rover found themselves in around 1999. They had been purchased by BMW from British Aerospace back in 1994, and this was for the sum of £800 million. Now, the BMW person driving this was Bernd Pinschenschreider. I do apologise to any German viewers for that horrific pronunciation. And he was keen to keep up with other manufacturers such as Ford and VW, who were buying up other brands to sort of basically fill gaps in their own offering. So by buying Rover, he also obviously got Land Rover, so it filled up the 4x4 gap that they had, and they also could fill the smaller car market, because at that time BMW was basically 3 Series and upwards. So come the end of the century, what was the Rover offering to the market? Well, the core bit was the Rover 200 and 400 models, but these were launched back in 1995, probably halfway through its sort of natural life cycle of manufacture. And the other problem was they were based on Honda technology, so BMW were having to pay Honda a royalty to cover that technology. There was also the MGF that had been launched in 95, but again that was probably sort of halfway through its life cycle. The other thing they had was the old Mini, but of course that was very much towards the end of its life, and we knew the new R30 codename Mini was coming along in around about 2001. Really the high point was the Rover 75, which was one that had been jointly developed with BMW. But interestingly, when that was launched in 1998, our friend Bernd Pinschenschreider, he actually had a bit of a go at the motor show in his announcement, saying that Rover was in crisis and we needed government support to continue with the project. Bear in mind at this time, Rover had been developing the what was called the R30 Project, which was designed to replace the 200 and 400 and would have been the basis for a sort of hatchback, a saloon, and also a small MPV. And this would have been competing against the Golf, the Focus, and so on. Financially, Rover was in one hell of a mess. In 97, it had lost £91 million. 98, it had lost around £647 million. And in 1999, it was losing £750 million. That's around £2 million a day. Obviously, losses like that aren't really sustainable, so it was no wonder that BMW were having concerns. So in June 1999, Stephen Byers, who was the Trade and Industry Secretary, agreed a £152 million subsidy, balanced against the £3.3 billion that BMW were putting in, for this new model to be manufactured at Longbridge. All's good, everyone's happy. And as late as October 1999, BMW externally were being very positive regarding the future of Rover, and obviously this new investment was coming on board, so all was good. But to give you an idea of scale of Longbridge at that time, it was employing around 9,000 people, producing about 140,000 cars. But of course there was also all the businesses in the area that were employing people that manufactured and supplied parts to the Rover factory. So enter into our little story a chap called Jon Moulton. No, not that Moulton, that was Alex Moulton, the one with the bikes with the small wheels. Jon headed up a company called Alchemys Partners, who were venture capitalists, and the less generous amongst people would suggest they were asset strippers. And basically what they did was buy up generally failing companies, turn them around and then sell them on later for a profit. Or alternatively, if there was value within the assets, they would strip those out and make their money back that way. He had an investment with a company called Hayden McLennan, who was a company that supplied, of all things, camouflage nets. And he was at a meeting there and discovered that they were having trouble keeping up supplies to their biggest customer, who was Rover. And you think, well, why are Rover buying camouflage nets? Well, it turned out that Rover were producing around about 50% more cars than what they were actually able to sell. So what are camouflage nets? To cover up the cars so people didn't know about this sort of failing. And they had something in the region of around about 50,000 unsold cars that they were trying to keep covered up. Now, Jon had previous involvement with Land Rover and Rover. He'd been involved with an attempt for a Land Rover management buyout back in '86. He'd been involved with a potential Rover buyout back in 1988. And he'd also, on a similar area, tried to do a buyout of Lotus in the past. So he had some car industry experience. So Jon launched Project Crufts, which was his code name for this Rover buyout. He approached BMW and was basically welcomed with open arms. This Rover project had become a bit of a problem. Following a boardroom fallout, Bernd Pinter's had left back in, I think, February 1999. So he was the main driving force behind this, and obviously they were still landed with what they described as their English patient. With discussions with BMW, Jon came up with suggestions that they could recover some of their $3 billion they've invested so far. This is excluding what they were going to invest in this new model, by selling Land Rover to Ford, who were interested in acquiring it. And of course, by this point, BMW had come up with their own X5 4x4, which apparently didn't use a lot of Land Rover underpinnings. I'll allow you to discuss that one in the comments. And also for him to take on Rover for effectively a pretty nominal sum. And they were very warm to this idea. So the outline deal that they agreed is that Alchemy would give BMW £50 million for the Rover business. BMW would write off the £2 billion debt that the Rover company was basically saddled with at that time. They would give Alchemy the Longbridge factory, and they would give them a £500 million restructuring sum for a transition period. They would also give them all the unsold stock, so that was around about this 50,000 cars that Rover were trying to hide. And they would also give them the rights to the old Mini, the Rover 200, 400, MGF and Rover 75. And BMW would keep the new Mini, so that would fit into their desire to produce a smaller car. So in this way, I think BMW's plot was they could sort of walk away without too much flack. Yes, there was going to be job losses, but it sort of kept them a little bit clean. And obviously UK was a big market for BMW, and they didn't want people to stop buying BMWs because they're seen as the bad guys, or so they thought. So what was the Alchemy plan? Well, they were going to rename Rover to the MG Car Company, and the plan was to produce a sort of smaller and larger sports car in more of a niche factory setup, something more down the lines of Lotus, and basically get out of mass car manufacturing. And obviously this was going to have quite an impact on jobs. As I mentioned earlier, they had 9,000 employees at this time. I've heard various numbers. Initially I've heard it would be halved, and actually I've heard subsequent discussions where Jon was allegedly quoted to say it could have been as low as 1,500. However, I do want to make one quick point here, is that obviously with all those cars that needed to be sold, and obviously with production ongoing, this would have been the case where production would have slowed down, obviously, and eventually stopped. This would have given people a chance to find other jobs. It would have given suppliers a chance to diversify. If we fast forward to 2005, when it stopped dead, when people sort of didn't overly expect it, it left a lot of people high and dry. So this is one of the reasons I think this was a better plan. The other ideas that Jon had, he wanted to relaunch MG back into America, and one of the reasons they hadn't been selling there is that BMW had launched the Z3 into America and it was doing quite well, and they didn't want the MGF to take sales away from it. So Jon saw this as a big opportunity to take that brand back to the USA. And finally, they would buy in engines, gearbox, etc. from other manufacturers to keep their own development costs down. Now, this deal, i.e. BMW selling Rover to Alchemy, was announced at the same time as the deal of BMW selling Land Rover to Ford in the middle of March 2000. And this gave Alchemy 6 weeks to do their due diligence, where the deal would be completed at the end of April. This announcement came as a complete surprise to everybody, unions, workers, etc., and it did cause uproar. The alternative Phoenix bid was put together literally in a few days, and it was supported by Stephen Byers, yes, Trade and Industry Secretary. Now, a little bit more on Stephen Byers. You can go and look him up. It's quite interesting. He has quite a history. He, with his involvement with Railtrack a few years later, resulted in the largest ever class legal action the UK has ever seen. He was banned for committing fraud on his expenses from standing for Parliament, and I will actually leave it to the Spectator to give a summary of Stephen Byers' competency. The most incompetent, the most cynical, and the most financially illiterate cabinet minister of the last 20 years. Couldn't have said it better myself. Now, the problem that raised its head, Stephen Byers was supporting this Phoenix bid. Of course, it helped the fact that Longbridge was in Birmingham, which were marginal seats at that time for the Labour Party, and there was an election coming up the following year. BMW were obviously getting some flack. It was looking like they were betraying the loyal workers of Rover, because a lot of them were going to get made redundant, etc., etc. And this wasn't turning out possibly quite as well as I believe BMW thought it would. Now, the problem Phoenix had was that Alchemy had exclusive due diligence on this deal up until the end of April, so they couldn't look at any of the detail figures and so on. But Alchemy sort of ploughed ahead with their deal. In fact, the government reaction was so strong they actually called in Jon Moulton to a sort of select committee investigation to question him why he was buying it and what was he doing, and he was the bad guy and all this kind of thing. And if you read the transcript, and I'll put a link in the description below, you see he gave very sensible answers, and there was just, you know, politicians doing what politicians basically do, shall we say. The other problem that had reared its head, which no one seemed to expect, was the fact that the Rover dealers were actually getting together for a group legal action against BMW, because they had invested heavily, because they were being promised the new Mini, which we all know became a very successful car, would be arriving in their dealerships in 2001. And of course now it was going to stay with BMW and become one of their cars. So there was potential for quite a kickback financially that side as well. And ultimately this became probably the point that made the deal fall over. Come the 27th of April, Alchemy thought, we're on the home straight, this deal's going to be done. Yes, there's been some negative PR, but you know, we're going to be fine. They went to a meeting at BMW. BMW offered another 500 million to help sweeten the deal. However, they wanted Alchemy to guarantee the £1 billion of loans that had been given to Rover dealers for their various improvements ready for the new Mini. And Jon Moulton said, well, it just made them insolvent on day one. No one was ever going to take that deal. And in later interviews, he said, actually, you know, some of the BMW lawyers were stifling giggles, because they knew what they were proposing from the BMW side no one could accept. And the reason I believe they were doing that is that they wanted the Phoenix deal to go through, because it would be, nobody's going to lose their job immediately. Rover are going to look better than they would with the Alchemy deal. And so they could walk away fairly clean of what had happened. And at that point, basically Alchemy had to withdraw their offer. And, you know, John's view is, yes, BMW scuppered it because they wanted the Phoenix deal to go through. So just a few days later, on the 8th of May, it was announced that the deal with Phoenix had been agreed, and they were going to give BMW a token £10 for the business, and BMW basically gave the Phoenix group everything that they had originally agreed to give to Alchemy. The difference being, because there was still going to be continued mass car production, the dealers were on board, so the threat of that litigation had been dropped away. And of course, we all know what happened 5 years later, and there's lots of videos out there that discuss that, but I thought this one was a little bit different. So tell me in the comments what you think. Should, despite the potential bad PR, the deal with Alchemy Partners gone through. Jon Moulton seems to have done his due diligence. You know, the ideas of getting other manufacturers to invest, you know, which Phoenix tried a few years later. You know, Jon Moulton had already done that due diligence and knew no one was interested. So I think he knew what he was doing. It just wasn't popular at the time. And that's not necessarily the reason not to do something, is it? But as I say, let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks again for watching. See you next time.